Welcome, everyone, to today's DZone Fireside Chat, Observations in Observability, a new era in application performance. Observability has evolved from its roots in control theory and is now a prominent aspect of modern software development. Today's systems are complex, complicated creations with a lot of moving parts. And in order for them to run smoothly, we need to be able to see inside without slowing down the system or interfering with its operation. Today, we'll be covering observability's role in modern development, challenges and best practices that you can take away to achieve effective observability in your own software development pipeline. And then we'll end with some glimpses into what the future may look like based on where we are today. My name is Jesse, and I'm the Chief Technologist here at DZone. I'll be our moderator. I'm super excited to introduce a few experts joining us as we explore the topic. First of all, Greg Leffler. Hey, Greg. Wave, Observability Practitioner Director from Splunk, and Joanna Carvalho, SRE from Virtuoso. And it's exciting to have people who've been with us before. So Joanna, welcome back. And Greg, welcome. Super cool to have y'all here. Our focus today is going to be around performance, but I really want to start with the evolving role of observability in modern software development, right? Like, question, how has the concept of observability evolved over the years, particularly with the rise of distributed systems and microservices? And Greg, let's go ahead and start off with you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, observability is still relatively new. Like you said at the beginning, it's becoming very, very common and people, know about it now. But the concept of observability really started back from monitoring. And as soon as people started to put businesses online, right, they needed to have a way to make sure that the business was making money and was successful and the customers were happy. So we started with monitoring, a 3-tier legacy application where everything ran on one box and it was super simple. And now, like you also said, like applications are incredibly complicated, right? There's hundreds of tiny services that are all doing like one really, really specific thing. But if one of those is broken or overloaded or whatever, like then the application doesn't work. So, the concept of observability really came into view because, like you said, it came from control theory, it came from managing factories, and a microservice app is kind of like a factory, right? There's a million little components in it. There's a million little things that go on.
Totally
So
is.
it really makes sense to apply it there. And I think, distributing the system as well also kind of contributes to this need, right? You need to be able to see if service A is calling service B, like there's a lot of things that can go wrong in between there. And it isn't all necessarily stuff that you can see on your server either, right? Like applications now run in the user's browsers, they run on their phones. There's lots of code that you have no visibility into at all without an observability tool. So that to me is like a really exciting thing, is because there's so much more to look at now, right? It's I really like, geeking out on a hard system to figure out what's going on with it. So like to me, it's super exciting, but that's really where observabilities came from, right? We have to have it because the apps are so much more complicated.
Yeah, and listen, we're not talking log files anymore.
Yeah.
And 1,000 lines of log files. Joanna's laughing because she knows where I'm going with this. These systems are huge. We're talking millions of things to process. And Joanna, from your seat as an SRE, I mean, you see this every day. But you've also been around for a while. So in your view, from an SRE perspective, I remember when an SRE wasn't a thing. Right. So tell me a little bit about how that role has evolved and is evolving too in the midst of these super complicated observability issues.
I don't think SRE is a thing yet, because it means so many different things in so many different companies. But like in terms of looking at logs, we are there with everyone. So I think SRE evolved with observability. Actually, I think it became a necessity maybe as the systems grew, and has the necessity of maintaining ever more complex systems, more intricate systems grew as well, because it's not like one thing is having a monolith, which, let's say, it has some advantages when it comes to monitoring and observability. Yeah. Like, where the issue is. Like, there's like one line that guides your transactions. But now it's different. I crossed a term the other day. It's nano services. So the world is your oyster now, and It's becoming ant farms. When Greg was talking about factories, all I could picture was ant farms, because it's like service after service after service, and we need to understand how they connect to each other. There is an issue somewhere, but we need to understand what was the path that particular action took that led to that problem. Mm-hmm. And that's a really complex issue. And that's where observability came from, because you have to have correlation IDs, you have to have all these things to find a needle in a haystack. And I think SREs try to help with that, but also try to, I don't like to say this, but enforce that observability is in the list of, you have your definition of done, and observability is there with the other things. Because you can have reliability, you can have performance, you can have all that. But if you can't measure any of that, like it's like the tree thing in the forest. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make a sound if you can't measure it, and I think mostly nowadays SREs try to create best practices and enforce a state of mind and a mentality. Like there is the observability shift left now as well, which is super important. So, that's I talked a lot already, but I think that's the role observability and SREs like mixed together.
And it's interesting. I haven't heard of nanoservices yet, so that's new for me. So I stopped at micro. When we get to quantum services, I might have to throw a flag on the play. Because I was developing back in the 90s, monolithic systems, server client things were cool back then, right? Now it's not even something people compute. You see what I did there in their brains, because it's too simplified. Now, we took encapsulation, the idea of coding in small containers in, C++ programs, and we blew it up. Like you said, the world is our oyster. And now we're getting things so small that it's the tracing between the two that we have to figure out. How do we track down where this thing is, right? And I'm glad we got Greg, because Splunk is, I've used that tool. It does a really good job of tracing a bunch of really random stuff. But the relationships between it, which is what Joanna was just getting at, trying to find the relations between these things get really difficult. I mean, some of it looks even like a social map, right, between all the different things. And so, you can get really washed away by all of this data. And now I know why we created observability. That's why it's here, is to be able to map all this stuff. So talk to me a little bit about technologies. I kind of cheated. Fine, sue me. Splunk does some of this stuff. And I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Splunk, but it is a tool used for it. So Greg, if you can, talk a little bit about technology, right? Splunk, and I want you to choose one other. But things like how, containerization, right? Imaging, Docker, I'm going to say VMware, and I know that's kind of older school, but this idea of serverless computing, all of this stuff feeds into the requirements. Joanna said definition of done for observability. So how can some teams use some of these technologies as observability gets in there to make sure that we can actually troubleshoot issues in these environments?
It's interesting because one of the things that is really popular was sort of popular was this, like, everything's going to the cloud, right? We're moving everything to the cloud. Yep. And everything's going to be cloud native, and we're going to put everything up in AWS or whoever. And then, there were some macroeconomic changes, and people have suddenly realized, hey, the cloud's kind of expensive if we aren't really, using it to its best love, and that sort of thing. And there's also some services that just aren't suited for the cloud, right? There's some workloads that are not the best things, or they're proprietary, or they were developed by a C programmer in the 90s, sorry, right? Maybe aren't really ready to move up to the cloud, right? So one thing that's really key for observability is being able to integrate data from a bunch of different places, right? Like almost every application is going to have some component on premise, or there's going to be something in AWS and something in GCP or in Azure or in whatever. And there's nothing worse in a firefight. Like I was an SRE for a long time before I started doing this. So like, there's nothing worse than seeing a problem and going, all right, well, let me pull up my 14 different logging and security and whatever tools, right, to figure out what's going on. You need to see it all in one place. So the complexity of how we deploy the software has sort of driven the need for observability too, right? You need a tool that can understand stuff running in a bunch of different places. You also mentioned serverless, right? Like this thing isn't running anywhere really. I mean, it is obviously, right? But like, you don't have, if you try to think of monitoring in the old school monitoring way, like you can't install the Zabbix agent on a serverless service function, right? Like you have to have something that is built to understand what that is. So new technologies have really driven the need for observability. And, for Splunk's products too, right? Like we have, of course, the best log analysis tool. I would say I'm a little biased, but I would, we have the best log analysis tool. But increasingly, our customers demand observability. They want to see traces. They want to be able to do metrics natively. They want to be able to look at everything in one place. And the new technologies that have come up, like distributed tools, serverless, the cloud in general, have all contributed to this need for observability. That also creates some challenges, right? One of which is data volume, which I think we'll talk about later, but like that's a huge challenge. And Joanna's like, hey, we look at 1,000-line log file. I mean, it's nothing, right? I mean, my Mac spits out 10,000 lines when I open up a web browser, like, so the data volume you have times all the services you have times all the deployments, like you have to have something to figure out what's going on. Like you can't keep the state of the application in your head anymore. You can't figure out like, oh, service A talks to service B. It's like, okay, well, service QAN also talks to service YRX, right? Like, like nobody can keep that straight. So observability is important for that too. And like the development and the drive of new stuff is what helps grease that engine of observability.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Like serverless computing, it took me, and look, I've been in software development for going on 30 years. And when you talk about serverless stuff, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit when we first started talking about it. I'm like, what is it? Like what operating system, So anyway, it's super cool to think about that. And Joanna, from the Virtuoso side, right? What are some of the tools and things that you use there in your SRE stuff every day? And what do you like?
Maybe I'm just going to go with what I like.
Sure.
First, I like OpenTelemetry.
Okay.
I do. I have a weakness for it.
Okay.
Because that's like in Virtuoso. So we use high level language to write tests for customers. They don't like Jackie could be in a talk about that because he don't need to know programming to just write tests. But everyone can use whatever they feel more comfortable with for monitoring for their own. So have a big tool set for monitoring our application. My weakness is OpenTelemetry because I don't care what other people are using to monitor their thing, as long as they sit on this beautiful layer of abstraction, and that I can use that layer for what I like to use. And that's why I like OpenTelemetry. It integrates with Splunk. I think it has a very good integration actually. And Splunk is one of the biggest contributor actually, because I saw on the list. And for me, I used to be a performance engineer, and it's really important for me that observability is not just something engineers use for themselves.
Right.
So I want to see from the user perspective down. I want to be able to see, like, to have soak tests running and be able to understand how the potential user might be feeling when those tests are running. And I want to ask that question, and I don't want to have a number. I want to understand the experience.
Yeah.
You can only get that with observability. You can't get that with monitoring. And And it really made our life as performance engineers and SREs a lot easier. It used to be Excel sheets that actually I didn't hear, but they only go up to 100,000 lines, I think. And yeah, it's something you learn when you I don't know if that's true anymore actually, but or you use Python because it has pandas and you can crunch the data to give you a semblance of observability, because you have to go and, like Greg said, collate all of these sources.
Right.
And that's just a waste of time, waste of talent, money, and resources. So that's how I look at it. That's how I look at solving that issue. And having development teams actually onboarding, because you can have auto instrumentation on anything, but it's more meaningful when you have developers say, I want to trace this. This is important to me, and this is the baggage I want it to have. These are the properties that are important for the business model. Even product owners, I want to know many steps from adding to bag to purchase. I want to understand how many items, where the users are from, or some other like weird product metric, because observability is not just for the technical team, is for product as well, is to correlate everything. So we can know how much money we are spending. I use observability for something really sleazy. I think that's the word in English for it.
Maybe. Why don't you tell us and we'll tell you? Okay,
so whenever I want to justify a refactor or a performance improvement, observability helps, because you can correlate that improvement with money. And the next time you want to do a refactor, which is something everyone gets excited with, it's like spring cleaning and all that. You can just say to business, look how much money we saved, or how much money we are like getting back from these improvements. And that, money can justify anything mostly.
Yeah, that's not sleazy. I'd actually say, and Greg's nodding, I like that. But I think you had a couple of things in there that I want to tease out because they were really important, and I don't want, us to miss it. But you hit on some best practices that were really cool, right? Bringing a culture of observability into the development teams by making them think of specific problems they want to solve, or specific things that product management wants to see, or how can we make our software better by doing cost benefit analysis on a refactor. All of those things are actually really good tips for people out there to bring observability and make it real in their organization. Too often, one of the challenges that teams face, and I'll ask Greg you for some more challenges in a second, is that it's an afterthought. That it's not a definition, a done thing. It's, put some tracing or, back in my day, right, instrumentation stuff in there, and we can get the log files out. But it's got to be more. Observability's got to be more than that. And it's more than selecting the right tools, which we talked about, but it's also promoting that culture that you just talked so much about, and why it's so important to have that. So Greg, I'll pass it over to you. When you're thinking about the challenges that our teams face, because we're going to have a lot of people watching this that want to know how they can be better. We've got some good culture changes from Joanna, but what are some other ways that we can balance the need for what we would call comprehensive observability with the potential impact on the system performance and people performance, right? Because we have to make efficient use of that. And so, give us your thoughts on that, if you will.
And people performance is like the most interesting part of that question, because it's really like we hear a lot when we're trying to sell Splunk, for example. People will be like, no, I'm just going to build my own thing, right? Or I'm going to use an open source thing, or I'm going to do whatever. And it's like, that's fine, right? Like, we support OpenTelemetry for all the reasons Joanna said. We want everyone to use OpenTelemetry. It's a much better experience. It helps get that mindset going through all your people. But like, at the end of the day, engineers are hard to find. They're expensive. And the best use of your engineers is probably not re-implementing observability systems, right? Like it is
100% correct. Yes.
right? Like it is having them do stuff that brings value to your business. So like that's one thing that I think is important to remember. It's like there's only so many things one person can work on. And so if you choose flexible technology like OpenTelemetry, then you can pick later on down the line what tool you want to use. As you grow, you may need to use different tools than when you started. One thing that we see a lot is there are people who are like observability native, right? Like they want observability from the beginning, and maybe the company's not quite there yet. So they use their corporate Amex and they go buy a license to Datadog. And another team goes out and they buy a license to New Relic. And a third team goes out and they buy a license to Dynatrace, right? And so, you know, you run into a problem where some of those tools have their own, you know, magic agent that is not OpenTelemetry compatible and that is totally different from what everything else is using. And when it's time to try to integrate all that, because somebody realizes, hey, look at all these benefits we get from observability that we talked about earlier, like that's very difficult to do if you don't have the right foundation. So I would say like a key thing is having the right foundation. The OpenTelemetry, having an open instrumentation for your applications is super important. Having people understand that the business is why we do all of this, right? I mean, you know, it's fun to refactor. That's not an opinion I share, by the way, but sometimes it's fun to refactor because you get to play with a new thing, right? You get to learn a new language or do a new tool or whatever. But like as part of that process, the engineers have to know what is the business thing that we're tracking and instrument the application to emit that, right? No matter how good your auto instrumentation is, there's no way to automatically know, like, this is the start of the customer's journey through our site, right? Or the customer was targeted by a marketing campaign, and so we want to pay close attention to them, right? Like, there's no way for an auto instrumentation tool to know that. So you have to have observability as a mindset, like, throughout your whole organization. So that's super critical. Like, have the right mindset, have the people know there's value to this beyond the immediate performance impact. And then use the right tool. Like OpenTelemetry is infinitely flexible. You can do anything with it. You can emit data to as many observability tools as you want, right? So like you can say we have tool A, we're evaluating tool B and tool C and tool D, and they can all read the data from one agent, right? It's so much simpler to do it right the first time.
Yeah, that whole idea of Joanne, I think you said beautiful abstraction, I think was the term that she used, which I thought was fantastic, right? The idea of being able to tile this and weave it together, right? I think in terms of like data fabric and things like that, you want to have a single place to go, right? Or as few places to go as possible. If you're, like you said, if you've got, you know, Dynatrace and 10 other things, yeah, somebody's going to get some great insights from somewhere, but they're not all going to get it from the same place. And that's going to be a problem. So as we look forward into like the things that you use, we talked a lot about culture, which I love. Think a little bit about, and Joanna, this one's for you as an SRE. Like you've been through some things, right? So I want to ask you like a lessons learned question. If you could go back and talk to Joanna before on some things that you've learned, what would you say as you were getting started in some of this and helping out in all these different places? And I know that's kind of a quick question, but you know, what are some of these lessons learned? Okay. All right. Perfect. Lay it on us.
Start small.
Okay.
And be realistic.
All right. Tell me more. Give me some detail.
I think that happens to everyone when we you know, we want to implement something and we want to do everything perfect and right from the start. And as with anything else, observability. So realistically, and depending on the size of the company, if it's like a greenfield project or not, and you want to add observability, you are not going to add it. You are not going to like create everything from start, and you are not going to get it right from day one. And like maybe starting small, starting with just auto instrumentation, just to get the feel of what you get. And that was my mistake a couple of times, is like wanting the perfect thing and wanting it just by myself and not sharing with not opening to everyone. Another thing I learned is all those things are really nice, but developers already have a lot on their plate. So we have to make it as simple as possible for them to be able to instrument the code. Okay. So yeah, like I think it's kind of one of SRE's job description to enable the developers. So we are not making them have instrumentation. We are giving them the tools so they can make it in an easy way that does not disrupt their day-to-day coding or organizing.
Awesome.
But I think that I often, like, it's just auto instrumentation on something is buzzing, sorry. Auto instrumentation and have something simple just to see what you're getting, like Zipkin or something like that, or Jaeger. Because if you want, like, if you go and do that and then you buy something like Dynatrace or AppDynamics, which, like, the bill is not very nice, then you are already damaging the culture, actually, because people will associate observability with something expensive, painful, and it's very hard to change that perception afterwards. So if you have little wins, people will grow into it, and if you give business a really huge bill, they won't grow.
Yeah, that's not a best practice. That's a good.
That was what I learned. I know it's not very technical, but to be honest, also measure the observability, right? I think the monitoring, the instrumentation, because it can have a bit of overhead if not done properly. As a performance engineer, I've done that a couple of times, and there are systems that are like, I'm not even talking about OpenTelemetry, but there are APMs and observability systems that are heavier than others, especially if not used properly.
Got it. All right, Greg, same question for you. And the last thing I would say is, as you're given like some practical lessons for key takeaways, anything that you see coming in the future for observability from your perspective?
Okay, I'll start with the future first, actually. I think it's really interesting, and Joanna kind of alluded to it earlier. And to me, it's really focusing on the users, right? Like, using real user monitoring, using synthetics, using those kinds of tools is still relatively uncommon. Like, even places that have reasonably advanced observability practices, there are a lot that don't use those tools. To me, the greatest thing that I had in my career as an SRE and that helped me be successful was having empathy for our users, right? And really trying to be their advocate to developers, to other SREs, that sort of thing, right? Like, we want them to have the best experience possible, right? The site has to be up, obviously, right? But it also should perform well, and it shouldn't leak their data, and, they should feel safe when they're using it, and they shouldn't worry about, trolls and spam and all that, all of those things combined. So, like, I would say observability, the future is definitely moving beyond the here is our app, here is how it performs, here is a dashboard kind of thing. Like, it is going to become more of, how do our users feel about this? How are they experiencing this? And you're using data to tell you all that, right? Like, you can see, did they buy the widget? Did they, do whatever you wanted them to do? How fast did they do it? All that stuff is how you make those decisions. But I think people will start to think about it more in that way, like, as observability matures and people start to adopt some of the more advanced tools. From a best practice perspective, I think there's really two things. One is create a culture of observability. Like Joanna said, start small, right? You want to do little incremental wins. Big bang projects are very rarely successful, right, of any type, right? So, like, you really want to start with something small. And I would say start with OpenTelemetry. And I would say that even if Splunk didn't support it, I mean, like, the thing to start with, because you can then use whatever else you want later on down the line. You can start with a very, very tiny OpenTelemetry install that sends stuff to Zipkin, right, and Jaeger, and you can look at that, and then like you can advance to a more advanced tool as your needs grow, right? But yeah, like I love the OpenTelemetry heart. Yeah, thank you. But like it is the easiest thing to do to get started. It builds a framework. It's the same framework you're going to use when you're doing this really complicated, really advanced system, right? And the culture around, we all want to instrument everything. Everything needs to emit as much data as it can. And we don't want to throw that data away, like, is another thing I think is important, right? A lot of commercial observability tools, especially, will say like, hey, we need to sample, we don't send us the whole fire hose. We can't deal with it. There's too, and that's silly to me, right? like to me, you want to collect all the data that you can, because every piece of data has some sort of value. And in our systems, as complex as they are, sometimes you don't know what is the cause of a problem, right? Something that may have seemed completely unimportant at the time could be the cause of all these problems, right? Not to get super dramatic, but Chernobyl had a problem because some valve thing was broken, right? And nobody would have ever thought about like, oh, I need to instrument the status of this one valve over on this one pipe somewhere, right? Because, oh, there's 100 other things that look at that, right? Well, yeah, but at the end of the day, if the valve doesn't work, right, you're gonna have a problem.
Got
So
that's awesome.
You're not really probably using observability for a nuclear system, but if you are, like, it's something to consider. Like, you want to keep all the data you have. Every piece of data can give you some sort of useful insight. So like, have the right.
I think they use it at the CERN collider. Actually, I think they use OpenTelemetry. I saw it somewhere. So they might create a black hole, but at least they have metrics.
But it's like, yeah, have the right culture, use OpenTelemetry, know what your users are thinking and how your observability stuff impacts your users. That's what I would say.
That is perfect. That is perfect to end on Chernobyl. And I don't know if they used OpenTelemetry or not, but that is perfect. Thank y'all, Joanna, Greg, y'all been fantastic, very engaged and super fun conversation. As we end, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope and I trust that you were able to take away some practical advice on how to make your observability efforts work better for your organization. If you want to share this webinar or view any of our other on-demand events, you can visit dzone.com/events. And please, if you will, stay on for just one more minute. We'd love for you to fill out a quick survey. Thanks.